End of chapter 6 and on to chapter 7. Fawn fight. Smother mother. The recommendations in the last two paragraphs also apply to many of those survivors who are fawn fight types. Some can be quite aggressive in their attempts to help others. Typically, they equate helping with changing and can alienate others by persistently pressuring them to take their advice. The fawn fight type is the smother lover caretaker. Her caretaking approach of being over-focused on the other is sometimes a repetition of her childhood servant role. Moreover, her helpfulness is usually less self-serving than the fight fawn that we discussed in the last chapter. Nonetheless, the zealousness of her caretaking sometimes makes the recipient believe it when she says, "I just love you to death." In flashback, the fawn fight can deteriorate into manipulative or even coercive caretaking. He can smother love the other into conforming to his views of who she should be. Fawn fight types may periodically reach a critical mass of frustration that erupts when the patient refuses his advice or balks at his unwanted caretaking. Sometimes the fawn fight feels an entitlement to punish the other for their own good, especially in a primary relationship. The fawn fight is sometimes misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder. This is because the fawn fight can be emotionally intense during flashbacks. When triggered into a panicky sense of abandonment, he feels desperate for love and can vacillate dramatically between clawing for it or flatteringly groveling for it. He does not, however, have the core narcissism of the true borderline that we look at in the previous chapter. Another distinction between these two types is the fawn fight type seeks real intimacy. She is the most relational hybrid and most susceptible to love addiction. She stands in contradistinction to the fight fawn, who is more addicted to physical release and hence more susceptible to sex addiction. More on recovering from a polarized fawn response. Psychoeducation about their parents' roles in creating their fawn response has helped many of my clients. Many instantly grasped that their codependence comes from having been continuously attacked and shamed as selfish for even the most basic level of healthy self-interest. One 40-ish client estimated that she had scorned herself as selfish countless times, until one night she had the epiphany that she was by far not selfish enough. This occurred while she was reading the comments of respondents to a website for adult children of narcissistic mothers. Suddenly she realized that her mother was the only one with a monopoly of self-interest in her family. My client then realized that every time she thought of doing something for herself, she not only felt very anxious but also ashamed that she was acting as ghastly as her mother. Fawns need to understand that fear of being attacked for lapses of ingratiation cause them to forfeit their boundaries, rights, and needs. Understanding this dynamic is necessary but not sufficient step in recovery. There are many codependents who realize their penchant for forfeiting themselves, but who instantly forget everything they know when self-assertion is appropriate in their relationships. In early recovery, I became increasingly aware in new dating situations of how much I was over-eliciting my date. Eventually, I was struck by how little I had to say for myself, but I found it very difficult to break the pattern. Over time, I realized that my intention to be more forthcoming was frightening me into a flashback. This made me disassociate and forget everything I had planned to say. All I could think to do when my amygdala hijacking took my left brain offline was to get my date talking. I then regressed to the tried and true safe position of listening and eliciting. It wasn't until my therapist recommended that I write down some key words on my palm that I began to master the situation. Looking at the words brought my left brain back online, and I gradually got better at holding up my end of the getting to know you conversation. Much later, I had the realization, no wonder I wind up with one narcissist after another. Narcissists love me because I am so enabling of their monologuing. I probably met lots of nice, balanced people who did not want another date with me because it seemed like I was hiding and hard to get to know. Around this time, I also had a fawn-type friend who had the same problem. She liked to joke that her listening and eliciting defenses were so perfected that she could turn anyone, even a blank-screen therapist, into a monologuing narcissist. To break free of their codependence, survivors must learn to stay present to their fear that triggers the self-abdication of the fawn response. In the face of their fear, they must try on and practice an expanding repertoire of more functional responses to fear. Facing the fear of self-disclosure. Real motivation for surmounting this challenge usually comes from family of origin work. We need to intuit and puzzle together a detailed picture of the trauma that first frightened us out of our instinct of healthy self-expression. When we emotionally remember how overpowered we were as children, we begin to realize that it was because we were too small and powerless to assert ourselves. But now in our adult bodies, we are in a much more powerful situation. And even though we might still momentarily feel small and helpless when we are triggered, we can learn to remind ourselves that we are now in an adult body. We have an adult status that now offers us many more resources to champion ourselves and to effectively protest unfairness in relationships. Grieving through codependence. I usually find that deconstructing codependence involves a considerable amount of grieving. Typically, this entails many tears about the loss and pain of being so long without healthy self-interest and self-protection. Grieving also unlocks healthy anger about a life lived with such a diminished sense of self. This anger can be used to build a healthy fight response. Once again, the fight response is the basis of the instinct of self-protection, of balanced assertiveness, and of the courage that is needed to make relationships equal and reciprocal. Later stage recovery. To facilitate the claiming of assertiveness, I encourage the survivor to imagine herself confronting a current or past unfairness. This type of role-playing is often delicate work, as it can invoke a therapeutic flashback that brings up old fear. As the survivor learns to stay present in assertiveness role-plays, she becomes more aware of how fear triggers her into fawning. She can then practice staying present to her fear and acting assertively anyway. With enough practice, she then heals the developmental arrest of not having learned to feel the fear and do it anyway. This, in turn, sets the stage for deconstructing self-harmful reactions to fear, like giving or compromising too much. Moreover, it makes the survivor more adept at flashback management. As later stage recovery progresses, the survivor increasingly knows her own mind. She slowly dissolves the habit of reflexively agreeing with other people's preferences and opinions. She more easily expresses her own point of view and makes her own choices. And most importantly, she learns to stay inside herself. Many fawns survived by constantly focusing their awareness on their parents to figure out what was needed to appease them. Some became almost psychic in their ability to read their parents' moods and expectations. This then helped them to figure out the best response to neutralize parental danger. For some, it even occasionally won them some approval. Survivors now need to deconstruct this habit by working to stay more inside of their own experience, without constantly projecting their attention outward to read others. Fawn types who are still habituated to people-pleasing must work on reducing their ingratiating behaviors. I have noticed over the years that the degree to which a survivor strains to please me reflects the degree to which his parents were dangerous. Recovering requires us to become increasingly mindful of our automatic matching and mirroring behaviors. This helps us to decrease the habit of reflexively agreeing with everything that anyone says. It is a great accomplishment to significantly reduce verbal matching. It is an even more powerful achievement to reduce inauthentic emotional mirroring. Dysfunctional emotional matching is seen as in behaviors such as acting amused at destructive sarcasm, acting loving when someone is punishing, and acting forgiving when someone is repeatedly hurtful. I call this emotional individuation work. As such, recovery involves setting the kind of boundaries that help us to stay true to our own actual emotional experience. In advanced recovery, this occurs when we reduce the habit of automatically shifting our mood to match someone else's emotional state. By this, I do not mean suppressing empathetic attunement when it is genuine. Crying and laughing along with an intimate is a truly wonderful experience. Rather, what I'm recommending here is resisting the pressure to pretend you are always feeling the same. As someone else. You do not have to laugh when something is not funny. When a friend is feeling bad, you do not have to act like you feel bad. When you are feeling bad, you do not have to act like you feel happy. Thankfully, I learned a great deal about this from being a therapist. When my client is depressed, it does not help him if I adjust my mood and act depressed. Yet I am always genuinely empathetic toward my client's depression because I can put myself in his shoes via my own experiences of depression. I can be there caringly for him without abandoning my own feeling of contentment in that moment. Similarly, I can be feeling depressed while you are enthused about something and genuinely appreciate your happiness without shamefully abandoning my temporarily depressed self. Here's another example of this. You are in a great mood and you tell me that you loved this old musical that you just saw. I, however, am feeling down and dislike old musicals. If I were a fight type, the table would be set for a great deal of mutual alienation. If I were an unrecovered fawn type, however, I might strangle my bad mood and my musical taste and anxiously squeeze out a high-pitched, forced frivolity about how wonderful Fred Astaire is. Instead, I can reach for a deeper, more authentic truth. I can let you know that I am pleased you had such a nice time. After all, I really believe in different strokes for different folks. As I write this, I flash on Bruno, a dear old hospice client of mine. During a visit with him, he told me, "I can't stand talking to that new volunteer. She acts so morose whenever she visits me. I mean, who the hell's dying here, me or her? I tell you, I don't know who is worse, her or that smiley volunteer, the one who always acts like she just walked into Disneyland." Disapproval is okay with me. Early in recovery, an esteemed mentor gave me the affirmation, disapproval is okay with me. Codependently, I enthusiastically welcomed his advice that I should practice it until it was true. Privately, I thought, surely you jest. I had survived the previous 30 years with a Will Rogers-like mission to prove that I never met a man I didn't like. I did not yet know that I had unconsciously gravitated to this all or none nonsense because I was somewhat desperately trying to seduce someone I met into liking me, in the hope that I could finally feel safe. As I thought further about this affirmation, I judged it as patently absurd and eminently unachievable. Yet within a week, something ignited in me that really wanted it to become true. Since it was still a long time before I knew anything about codependence, it took me almost 2 decades to make any progress at all. The importance of learning to handle and accept disapproval faded in and out of my awareness myriad times. But now as I write 30 years later, I feel it is one of the most important things I have ever learned. I rest most of the time in receiving so much approval from my friends and intimates that I can usually let in their constructive feedback fairly easily. As a corollary to this, I rarely care what people think about me who I do not know or who did not know me. And of course, this is not a perfect accomplishment. Disapproval can still on occasion trigger me into a flashback, but it delights me to report that I now experience most disapproval with considerable equanimity. I even occasionally experience some people's disapproval as a good thing. Sometimes it is a validation that I'm doing the right thing and evolving in the right direction. Nowhere is this truer than with the disapproval of the narcissistic parent or partners of clients whom I'm working to rescue from their enslavement. Their disapproval of me is actually an affirmation that I have indeed been involved in the right action. Most of the time, disapproval is okay with me. Chapter 8. Managing Emotional Flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks are intensely disturbing regressions, amygdala hijacking, to the overwhelming feeling states of your childhood abandonment. When you are stuck in a flashback, fear, shame, and/or depression can dominate your experience. Ugh. There are some common experiences of being in an emotional flashback. You feel little, fragile, and helpless. Everything feels too hard, life is too scary. Being seen feels excruciatingly vulnerable. Your battery seems to be dead. In the worst flashbacks, an apocalypse feels like it will imminently be upon you. When you are trapped in a flashback, you are reliving the worst emotional times of your childhood. Everything feels overwhelming and confusing, especially because there are rarely any visual components to a ptsd flashback. This is because, as Goleman's work shows, amygdala hijackings are intense reactions in the emotional memory part of the brain that override the rational brain. These reactions occur so often that minor events can now trigger them into a panicky state. This is a list of 13 practical steps for helping yourself to manage an emotional flashback. 13 steps for managing emotional flashbacks. 1. Say to yourself, I am having an emotional flashback. Flashbacks take you into a timeless part of the psyche that feels as hopeless, and surrounded by danger as you were in childhood. The feelings and sensations you are experiencing are past memories that cannot hurt you now. 2. Remind yourself, I feel afraid, but I am not in danger. I am safe now, here in the present. Remember, you are now in the safety of the present, far from the danger of the past. 3. Own your need to have boundaries. Remind yourself that you do not have to allow anyone to mistreat you. You are free to leave dangerous situations and protest unfair behavior. 4. Speak reassuringly to the inner child. The child needs to know that you love him unconditionally, that she can come to you for comfort and protection when he feels lost and scared. Deconstruct eternity thinking. In childhood, fear and abandonment felt endless. A safer future was unimaginable. Remember, this flashback will pass as it always has before. Remind yourself that you are in an adult body, with allies, skills, and resources to protect you that you never had as a child. 7. Ease back into your body. Fear launches you into a heady worrying or numbing and spacing out. A. Gently ask your body to relax. Feel each of your major muscle groups and softly encourage them to relax. Tightened muscles send false danger signals to your brain. B. Breathe deeply and slowly. Holding your breath also signals danger. C. Slow down. Rushing pressures your brain's flight response button. D. Find a safe place to unwind and soothe yourself. Wrap yourself in a blanket, hold a pillow or a stuffed animal. Lie down on your bed or in a closet or in a bath. Take a nap. E. Feel the fear in your body without reacting to it. Fear is just an energy in your body. It cannot hurt you if you do not run from it. Eight. Resist the inner critic's drasticizing and catastrophizing. A. Use thought stopping to halt the critic's endless exaggerations of danger and its constant planning to control the uncontrollable. Refuse to hate, shame, or abandon yourself. Channel the anger of self-attack into saying no to your critic's unfair self-criticism. B. Use thought substitution and thought correction to replace negative thinking with a memorialized list of your qualities and accomplishments. 9. Allow yourself to grieve. Flashbacks are opportunities to release old, unexpressed feelings of fear, hurt, and abandonment. Validate and soothe your child's past experience of helplessness and hopelessness. Healthy grieving can turn your tears into self-compassion and your anger into self-protection. Cultivate safe relationships and seek support. Yeah, fucking right. Yeah, right. Those are nowhere. They don't exist. That's number 10, though. They just throw it in there. Cultivate safe relationships and seek support. Don't hate yourself for not finding it. Really hard to find. If you're not born with it, odds are good you won't find it. Take time alone when you need it, but don't let shame isolate you. Feeling shame doesn't mean you are shameful. Educate your intimates about flashbacks and ask them to help you talk and feel your way through them. Learn to identify the types of triggers that led to flashbacks. Avoid unsafe people, places, activities, and triggering mental processes. This is where isolation comes from. Practice preventative maintenance with these steps when triggering situations are unavoidable. 12. Figure out what you are flashing back to. Flashbacks are opportunities to discover, validate, and heal your wounds from past abuse and abandonment. They also point to your still unmet developmental needs and can provide you with motivation to get them met. Be patient with the slow recovery process. It takes time in the present to become de-adrenalized and considerable time in the future to gradually decrease the intensity, duration, and frequency of flashbacks. Real recovery is a gradually progressive process, often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Not an attained salvation fantasy. Don't beat yourself up for having flashbacks. My clients who post this somewhere conspicuous until they memorize the gist of it typically progress more rapidly in their recovery. You can easily print out a copy of the 13 Steps page on my website. Triggers and emotional flashbacks. A trigger is an external or internal stimulus that activates us into an emotional flashback. This often occurs on a subliminal level outside the boundaries of normal consciousness. Recognizing what triggers us can therefore be difficult. Nonetheless, becoming increasingly mindful of our triggers is crucial because it sometimes allows us to avoid flashback-inducing people, situations, and behaviors. External triggers are people, places, things, events, facial expressions, styles of communication, etc. that remind us of the original trauma in a way that flashes us back into painful feelings of those times. Here are some examples of powerful and common triggers. Revisiting your parents, seeing someone who resembles a childhood abuser, experiencing the anniversary of an especially traumatic event, hearing someone use a parent's shaming tone of voice or turn of phrase. Many triggers, however, are not so explicit. Sometimes all unknown adults can trigger us into fear, even when there is no resemblance of our original abuser. I still occasionally feel triggered when I come across a group of teenagers, because I grew up in a neighborhood where there were many violent ones. For this reason, my son, who is quite empathetic, joked that he will not become a teenager when he grows up. Sometimes someone looking at us, or even noticing us, can trigger us into fear and toxic shame. One of my clients once came in intensely triggered because a cat was staring at him. Other common triggers include making a mistake, asking for help, or having to speak in front of a group of people. Moreover, simply feeling tired, sick, lonely, or hungry can sometimes trigger a flashback. Any type of physical pain can also be a trigger. For many survivors, authority figures are the ultimate triggers. I have known several survivors who have never gotten so much as a parking ticket, who cringe in anxiety whenever they come across a policeman or a police car. It took me decades to overcome my intense performance anxiety about teaching. Nothing could trigger me more than an upcoming teaching engagement. Fortunately, I was unwilling to give up this activity because I enjoyed it most of the time once I got going. I did not make any real progress beyond learning to white-knuckle it until I recognized my performance anxiety as a flashback to the danger of talking at my family dinner. This recognition allowed me to see that I was unconsciously terrified that my parents were going to show up and scoff at me in public. At first, I, my critic, labeled this a preposterous idea. But when I started to imagine and practice aggressively defining myself against them on the drive to my teaching engagement, I soon experienced an enormous reduction in my anxiety. This experience led to me formulating step 6 in the flashback management steps above, as well as my idea about angering against the critic, which will be explored in the next chapter. The look, a common trigger of emotional flashbacks. Early on in working with this model, I was surprised that certain clients with relatively moderate childhood abuse were plagued by emotional flashbacks. Most of them, in fact, were quite sure that they had never even been hit. Many of them, however, talk about how they hated it when their parents gave them the look. The look, in most cases, is a facial expression that typically accompanies contempt. Contempt is a powerful punishing visage, backed up by an emotional force field of intimidation and disgust. A raised voice can be added intermittently to the look to amp up its power. When a parent gives the child gives the look to the child, she is telling him that he is not only in serious jeopardy, but that he is also a sorry excuse for a human being. Over time, the look can make the recipient feel terrified and repugnant, as it drives him into emotional flashbacks of fear and shame. When the look is used to control an older child, it commonly flashes her back to an earlier pre-memory time when the look was empowered by traumatizing punishment. The look rarely terrifies a child into obedience unless it has previously been paired with hitting or other dire consequences. Years of working at parental stress services convinced me that most young children ignore the look unless it was previously accompanied by traumatizing punishment. Typically, the look is empowered via a psychological process called conditioning. Here is a classic example of aversive conditioning. Technicians delivered an electric shock to an animal in a cage at the same time that they rang a bell. The animal, of course, has a fearful and distressed response to the shock. It does not, however, take many repetitions of pairing the sound with the shock before the sound alone elicits the same upset response in the animal. This is analog, I believe, to how a child learns to be terrified of the look. With enough pairings of the look with the physical punishment or extreme abandonment, the parent can eventually delete the smack and get the same results with just the look. With enough repetitions in early childhood, this pairing can last a lifetime, so that the parent can control the child forever with this look. In my hospice work, I have seen several dying 90-pound mothers still able to put the fear of God into their huge sons with the look. The look then is a powerful trigger for making adult survivors flash back to fear and humiliation of their childhoods. Once again, many of my clients do not remember this because the punishment only had to accompany the look for a few months, while they were toddlers, before it became permanently wired as a trigger. Moreover, it is the rare person who has any memory before he is 3 or 4 years old. Unfortunately, the look can continue to work even after the parent dies. There are at least 2 reasons for this. First, we internalize our parents in a way that they can subliminally appear in our imaginations and give us the look whenever we are less than perfect. This includes imperfections in thoughts, feelings, or actions. Sadly, I often see this subliminal look mimicked on the face of my flashback clients as they scowl contemptuously at themselves. And second, when anyone else looks at us disapprovingly, we can generalize that we are as dangerous as our parents. This is what happened to me in the emotional flashback I described in Chapter 1. The worst thing about having been traumatized with the look in childhood is that we can erroneously transfer and project our memory of it onto other people when we are triggered. We are especially prone to doing this with authority figures or people that resemble our parents, even when they are not sporting the look. Internal or external triggers. As we move out of early recovery, we begin to observe the internal triggers are even more common than external ones. Such triggers are commonly the nasty spawn of the inner critic. Typically, they are thoughts and visualizations about endangerment or the need for perfection. The survivor may, seemingly without reason, visualize someone being abusive. Moreover, he can also seemingly out of the blue worry himself into a flashback by simply thinking he is not perfectly executing a task that he is undertaking. He can also frighten himself by enumerating the many ways that he might mess up any upcoming task. When internal triggering is at its worst, small potato miscues and peccadillos trigger us into a full-blown emotional flashback. We can devolve into a polarized process of negative noticing, an incessant preoccupation with defects and hazards. We perseverate about everything that has gone or could go wrong. As recovery progresses, many survivors are shocked to discover that the majority of their flashbacks are triggered internally by these types of inner critic programs. We will explore below and in the next 2 chapters the way we can rescue ourselves from the critic's internal triggering process. Progressive trigger recognition. With ongoing recovery, we become more knowledgeable about our triggers and avoid them when practical. Identifying our triggers also helps us to get into flashback management mode more quickly. Recognition further aids us to handle unavoidable triggering situations. Forethought allows us to prophylactically practice flashback management before we get activated, as I did in the performance anxiety situation mentioned earlier. Recognizing the moment of triggering is even more important than recognizing the trigger itself. This is because flashbacks sometimes start out subtly and then progressively become more intense. Early recognition, therefore, helps us to invoke the steps earlier and decrease the intensity and duration of the flashback. Finally, resolving a flashback requires a rebalancing significant biochemical changes in the brain and body that take time to subside. For example, over-adrenalization sometimes dramatically morphs into the hangover of adrenaline exhaustion, before the adrenaline function can be rebalanced. Decreasing the intensity of a flashback with a quick remedial action decreases the time it takes for our physiology to recover.